All right, welcome everybody to Pro 150 on communication. Tonight we have some good material. Our agenda is to cover, some of the expectations and feedback from last week, expectations and feedback for this week on the discussion board, which is our main coursework for this particular mod. And then after we do that, we've got some articles, assigned reading articles that we'll cover, and just some basic talking points from those. And then I've also got 3 or 4 other books or authors that I'd like to discuss regarding communication. So we'll get started here. Hopefully you all feel like things are going okay at this point. All your grading to this point that on anything that you've turned in on time is complete. Meaning, if you don't have a grade on something, or if your grade doesn't look right, you should be in touch with me right away via email, text, call, whatever you need to do so that we can discuss where you're at. So if you look up your grades and you see something that you don't understand or the feedback doesn't make sense, be in touch with me. Sometimes mistakes are made, and I'm happy to review or re-review those grades and assignments to make sure that everything's in good order. Many of you at this point, between the first 2 weeks, have some additional posts that you could make to the discussion board in order to get some additional points. No guarantee on how fast I will grade late work or additional submissions or edits that you do, but I would strongly encourage you to add posts if you need to. So in week 2, there were 4 total posts required by the instructions. In week 1, there were 3 total posts required from the instructions. So just make sure to this point you've done at least 7 comments between the 2 weeks so that I can give you the points that you are able to get in the class to this point. So halfway through the class, we've done about half of the available points. A little bit more than half of all the available points in the course have already been graded. And like I say, you still get most of the points for turning things in on late. So I'd strongly encourage you, even at this point, to go back in and make sure you've got all 7 posts from week 1 and week 2. That's a combined 7 posts, 3 in 1 and 4 in week 2. Thought it was another good discussion board last week. I'm excited for this week. This week is a little different. Last week was an Excel sheet, right, that we attached. This week we're going to be attaching a PowerPoint, get a little bit of experience or some an assignment regarding or using PowerPoint's always a good exercise. PowerPoint's probably, between PowerPoint and Excel, they're probably the 2 most commonly used formats for business presentations. I would say, Excel more for the numbers and PowerPoint more for a presentation, right? So PowerPoints can be an effective tool, a visual tool, like we talked about. Everybody learns and likes to communicate differently. And if the purpose of communication is to create understanding, sometimes having visual aids is highly effective to helping accomplish that understanding. So PowerPoint can be a great tool. I hope you'll find yourself using it and feeling comfortable with it. If you do the 2 pages this week and still feel a little bit uncomfortable, I would encourage you to go to the computer lab through the school or find some online tutorials, even just on YouTube, just quick video tutorials about using PowerPoint, because at a base level, you'll want to be able to use PowerPoint. Most workplaces in some way will use PowerPoint. Doesn't mean that it'll be your day-to-day job, but at some point, if you have to give a presentation about what you do or to a team or some aspect of what you're doing for your team, PowerPoint's pretty common tool. So that'll be a good opportunity this week to have a couple slides. You can see by my PowerPoints, I'm not some aficionado on PowerPoint. That's not the purpose this week, but it is to format a couple slides in a way that's visually appealing and make sure that you pay attention to the notes requirement associated with those slides as well, so I can give you full credit. What you'll be doing in addition to some slides and getting feedback in PowerPoint on some slides, the feedback though will be based on the required readings and videos. As in weeks past, you'll want to demonstrate that you've reviewed those required readings and videos, and then also kind of a strange side assignment for this week is to observe people communicating with each other. So, and I mentioned on the announcement board today, don't put yourself in a situation where it'll be awkward or creepy, or something like that. But if for example, at a Walmart, you can just be doing your normal shopping. You don't have to go out of your way, and if you're paying attention, we'll see multiple people communicating with one with another, whether or not it's employees with customers, or spouses with each other, or parents with children, or friends that come into Walmart. They'll be communicating with each other, and you don't have to stare them down. You don't have to follow them around the store. Please don't do that. But just in your normal course of errands that you might have to run, or maybe going out to eat at a fast food restaurant, just looking around the restaurant, and just taking a mental note on how people are communicating and what things that you notice about their communication. So anyway, just a fun opportunity to observe. Maybe it's something that you already enjoy people watching. Maybe it's something that you really don't pay any attention at all to other people, and this will be something a little bit different, and an opportunity to see how it looks when other people are communicating with each other. I think there could be some things that come from this little exercise that might surprise you about your own communication, how you communicate with other people, and how it looks to third parties, to other people. So along with that, this week you're going to have a couple videos and a couple articles. The good news is the videos are fairly short. I think one of them's a few minutes. That's Linda's video, that tries to pitch us on buying her course on communicating with somebody in a very difficult situation. So this is just a pre-up, a tee-up for her course that she sells. But it's got some very good tips, some basic tips about communication. And then there's another video that's meant to be more humorous than anything, but it does have an effective point, and that is when there is miscommunication, sometimes it can end very poorly. So I'll just say that. It's just a 30-second clip. It's pretty fun, so I hope that you'll review those videos, but does demonstrate very effectively the fact that if there's a miscommunication, sometimes it can go very wrong and have a very poor outcome, let's just say that. And in life, I think all of us can look back and say, maybe not that humorous, of a situation, but all of us can think back to situations where either we were misinterpreted or we misinterpreted somebody else, what they were trying to do or say. And sometimes that gets us into trouble or has pretty significant consequences that can be negative, right? So Linda's video, there's a couple key elements of that before you get to reviewing it, hopefully, that I want you to think about or make note of as you review her feedback. So she's got a couple things. She talks and refers to people giving and receiving in a conversation. And so if somebody's telling you a story, obviously they're the giver at that point, and you're the receiver. If they're trying to communicate something important to you, if a manager comes to you and says, hey, so-and-so, I have something important I need to tell you, you immediately are turned into the receiver, right? And the person who's trying to communicate that message is then the giver. There are just some basic rules about being a good listener, like we've already talked about, and being a good communicator that apply to a conversation based on whether or not you are giving or receiving. And in a basic conversation with somebody, usually you'll do both roles, right? So there's always a chance that a manager might come in and just be the giver, right? And you never do anything but receive. But in most conversations with colleagues, with family, you name it, as far as communication is concerned, you'll have a two-sided conversation where somebody will be giving and somebody will be receiving. If we had folks who were listening tonight in the live session and here for the recording, I would interact with those folks throughout the night. Most of the time I would be the giver because I need to make sure and communicate information, right, that I've prepared. But at various times throughout the night, I would also be a receiver when I ask a question and somebody's trying to communicate a point, or a story to me, even if it's non-verbal, right? Even if they're just typing it into the chat box and then I'm verbally responding. So it doesn't really matter if it's verbal, non-verbal, whatever it is. We need to be cognizant of who is the receiver and who is the giver and some of the rules that apply. Obviously, as a receiver, we're trying to be an excellent listener, right? A proactive, assertive listener. And as the giver, we're trying to also be sensitive to our audience, right? Whoever it is that we're communicating to, trying to read what, how our message is being received and whether or not it's being understood, like we've talked about, as the purpose of communication, understanding. So just an interesting point that she makes, and some good points, sub-points on tips for both giving and receiving. She talks, of course, about nonverbal issues like eye contact, like whether or not you shake your head can have a significant, she gives the example of nodding your head or shaking your head back and forth, obviously communicates something, right? And so even if you're not really even thinking about it, if you're nodding your head trying to be an active listener, the person might automatically think that you're agreeing with them, right? Instead of just being a good listener. Or if you're shaking your head and you're trying to communicate something, they might think it is something negative or that you disagree with, even if that's not what you're meaning. So we need to be careful about nonverbal cues, nonverbal communication that's being emitted, obviously, and we've talked a little bit about that. She talks a little bit about setting and how setting's pretty important. I can attest to this. This is something that that's people in my business as financial advisors many times will go golfing, right? Because in a golf situation, it's usually quiet. You usually have time to just one-on-one visit with somebody, quite a bit of time actually, in a beautiful setting usually, doing something that's kind of fun. And there's a lot of time, right? So there's it's not just really short and quick. It's usually something that's prolonged. So that's a pretty uniquely good opportunity to talk about business, talk about investments, talk about planning, talk about your credentials, those kinds of things. Get to know somebody really well. Golf tends to be a uniquely good opportunity for that. Now, I've had business lunches, which is another communication opportunity with clients, go both ways. What I mean by that is go both ways, good and bad, as far as their outcome. I've had work lunches where I was in a restaurant that was noisier than normal, that we got poor service, the food wasn't as good for some reason, and it was difficult to communicate, what I wanted to communicate with the person I was having lunch with. It also can be a situation where they might be rushed, to get back to work. And so in that situation, you just don't have a really good opportunity to get to know one another very well. And then I've had very good luncheons where, I feel like there's privacy, which is important, and quiet, so that you can have a good conversation. The service and food and servers are doing a great job and keeping you well serviced. If all those things come together, a luncheon can be a great opportunity to get to know somebody and execute on some business. So the setting can obviously make a big difference. Another issue is office. I've got a small office that I do business in, and then I've got a conference room that's pretty impressive. It's very nice. Has a large TV that I can put up planning and different information on. And there is a difference in how people interpret what it is that I'm talking about depending on where I do it. So if I do it in the conference room, it's very nice on the big screen TV and present information, that comes across differently than in my small office, that where I have files all over the place, and it's kind of a tight fit, and it's not nearly as impressive as the conference room. So just setting has a lot to do with the tone and mood of the conversation. I think I mentioned last week, back to the food issue, something that was interesting, which is they've done studies on food and eating food together. If you eat a similar thing, it's more likely that the person will feel more agreeable with you. And it's not something that we consciously think about, right? If we go to lunch and somebody orders a hamburger and we order a hamburger and we both eat hamburgers, we don't think, well, I'm more agreeable with this person. But they've done studies, and if you eat similar things with someone else, then you tend to be more agreeable to what it is, their message, whatever message they have to say, than if you eat different things. So one of the things that to just be cognizant of is, if you're in a sales meeting, eat something similar with the people that you're trying to communicate with. It's a form, it's a connection, even if it is subconscious, that can help your setting, help the effectiveness of your message and the motivation to do something in the end, which is also an important part of communication, right? What we've talked about. And then, of course, tone. And she talks a little bit about tone. We've talked about the way something is said is such a critical piece of communication. Not just what is said, but the way it's said. How loud or how soft, how aggressive your voice sounds versus how, maybe loving or passive or polite or kind. Different tones can carry a lot of meaning beyond the words that you're saying, obviously. So tone is very important. So that's a little, high level view of what Linda talks about. Like I say, it's a short video, but it's packed with a lot of good information. I hope you'll take a few notes and find some opportunity to learn something new or to think about something a little differently, because I think it's well presented. Then the reading, okay, on helpguide.org talks about engaged listening. And we've talked about listening last week quite a bit, so I'm going to skip over that. But it does talk about some additional things to think about. One of the things that I thought was interesting that I've never even thought about or heard before is how it mentions the fact that we should try to listen with our right ear, which kind of on surface sounds kind of strange, but just to make sure that you focus your listening on your right ear, because your right ear is affecting a part of your brain that's better at listening and processing information. And so just be aware of that, instead of having somebody talk into the left side, your left ear. It actually does help your understanding and ability to comprehend what somebody is saying to have them speaking into your right ear, which is just kind of a strange, just side note, but part of engaged listening, right? We want all the advantages we possibly can to be a good, engaged, excellent listener when it comes to communicating, because that side of the equation is such a big deal. There's a company here in Utah, Ken Garff Automobile, which is, of course, dealerships. They own a lot of dealerships and they sell a lot of cars, and they're one of the bigger dealerships in Utah County. And their whole ad campaign over the past year is how good at listening they are, their salespeople. And of course, when we think of car salespeople, we don't usually think of good listening, right? And so they're trying to change how we think about salespeople, and they're trying to convince us that their salespeople actually will listen to what it is that we want and need from a vehicle. And most of us would say, if we thought that somebody would actually follow through with that and be motivated by what it is that we want instead of just what they want to sell us, we'd be excited to work with that type of approach. So they've probably done some studies and found that people appreciate car dealerships that have a culture of more listening and less just trying to sell. And so they're really trying to advertise that. Whether or not it's effective just in advertising, I'm not sure, but I am sure that salespeople who do listen really well are probably more effective salespeople in the end. Another thing that the helpguide.org article talks about is a stress check. And this relates to the article that we read in a previous week about emotions and making sure that we have our emotions in check. We learn ways to cope and control our emotions. And so this article is talking about, in a different way, it's a different way of thinking about it, but basically we've got to make sure that in a stressful situation, we are able to remain calm in our communication, because calm communication is usually more effective than strained and stressful communication, right? Especially if we're trying to accomplish understanding. If we're just trying to warn somebody and need our child to get out of the street right before a car hits them and we can't get to them in time to grab them, it might be very appropriate to yell and be, very stern and frantic about it so that we get their attention quickly. But in most business situations, I can't think of many situations that are like that where we need to use a stressful tone or be in a stressful situation at work. We might be in a stressful situation, but we as the employee or the colleague or the manager, whatever it is that our role is within that business, we need to be calm, collected, cool, and be the person that people will say, that person's very level-headed and wise about how they respond and communicate about things, right? That's a great thing to have as a reputation, is somebody who stays level, calm, collected, confident. Those kinds of things describe somebody that we'd like to have on our team, right? We don't want the stress case person. So if you find yourself in a situation where you are the stress case person, that's not the end of the world. what we need to do is try to learn how to cope with that and still communicate as if we're more calm and collected than maybe even perhaps we are, right? And communicating that way will help us to think and feel more calm. So it's a catch-22, right? It's a cycling thing. The more we communicate it in a stressful way, the more stress we cause ourselves, and angst and anxiety we cause the situation. The more calm we are, the more we calm ourselves down, and the people around us. So, stress check is an important point. And then they talk about, one of the subtopics is what they refer to as assertive communication. So assertive communication is an interesting point that we haven't talked about yet in the course, but it relates to a lot of things that we have, and that is somebody who is assertive in their communication can be confident, but can also be graceful, can be clear and have clarity, and that mixture of different things can be highly effective as a communicator. And then finally, they talk about how you can respectfully decline things. You can say no to things as an assertive communicator. You don't always have to say yes. You are confident and calm enough to think on your feet and be able to respectfully decline a request of some kind. This has to do and is related to something we've talked about before, which is that people appreciate and eventually trust those who they feel like are genuine with them. And if you're a person that always just says yes to everything and always is wanting to be agreeable, that's a wonderful aspiration. However, we need to be careful that for the sake of being agreeable, we're not sometimes being disingenuous or dishonest about our response. If we really disagree with something, we should find a tactful, positive way or constructive way to communicate that we disagree. If we really can't accomplish something that somebody's asking us to do, we should communicate in a constructive way that we can't accomplish what it is that somebody's asking us to do. So if your manager continues to come to you and say, hey, I need you to work Saturdays, and you say, yeah, and then every Friday you back out on him because really, you've got family obligations and things that keep you from working Saturdays, at some point, and it happens very quickly, there's a breakdown in trust, there's a breakdown in communication, there's a breakdown in understanding, right? Because we're not being genuine and answering honestly when people are requesting things of us. So a way that we can be assertive in our communication and more effective in our communication, develop an honest, trustworthy situation, is that we're genuine, and that when a manager comes to us and asks us to do something, they will expect that if we say yes, we will absolutely do it. They will expect if we say no, we'll have a good reason behind that that's constructive, not whiny, not just excuses, but something legitimate, and that we're confident enough that we can communicate that in a way that we don't feel like we're going to offend anybody or push anybody away. It may sound difficult the first time that you do it, but if you do it in a tactful way, it will only be constructive with your relationship with that manager in the end. Might not sound like it will, but I promise you it will. It will develop that trust over time. They'll know that if you respond in a certain way, you'll absolutely follow through consistent with how you responded, and not like some people who either always whine and make excuses, which we don't want either. But the other extreme is somebody who always says yes and then doesn't follow through and doesn't do sometimes what they commit to do because they can't, right? They can't accomplish it that way. And I put grace here. One of the things that people misinterpret what I mean by grace, or sometimes have definitions for the word grace, right? Obviously, there's a religious, definition of grace. But when we're talking about grace when it comes to communication, and specifically assertive communication, we're talking about somebody who is gracious, is able to confidently thank people for something, thank people for their suggestions, even if they disagree. They can turn any situation into a constructive situation. Is a good way to think about what I'm talking about when we say grace, and what this article I think was getting at, which is you are always trying to be constructive in what you do and constructive in how you communicate with people, instead of negative, whiny, excuses. We all know somebody who's just disagreeable to be disagreeable. There's just different ways that you can communicate that eventually can become kind of toxic, both to yourself and to your colleagues, people that you work around, even to customers. And so it's not that we need to be Pollyanna and tomorrow just be the happiest person in the world. That's probably not going to happen for most of us. And I'm one of those people that I really struggle with that. I can't just be happy, to be happy. I have to work at that, and make sure that I'm positive and constructive. But you have to effort that, right? And if you effort it and are consistent with it, but very genuine about it, then it can really go a long ways to creating more effective communication at work. Okay. So those are some of the things. One other thing I'll just say on clarity is we've all been in situations where we've had a manager talk about expectations for us, talk about expectations for our team, and then we don't really know how they're going to measure it. We don't really know how to execute on it, and so then maybe they follow up a week or two later, or maybe they never even follow up. But it's not effective communication, right? Because there's not clear expectations. So one of the things that we've done in this class is that from week to week, there's a little bit of a different expectation when it comes to the discussion board, right? Week 1, there were 3 posts required. Week 2, there were 4 posts required. In the session, on the announcement board, within the discussion board itself, 3 different places, plus the instructions themselves, I went over and above the instructions to communicate that extra post was going to be required in week 2. And tried to be very clear about it, tried to be very careful that everybody would see that. The challenge for me is, obviously, as an instructor in a course like this, is I can communicate that and potentially even be fairly effective in how I communicate it, but people can still ignore the instructions. They can still ignore the session. They can still ignore the announcement board. They can still ignore different posts on the discussion board itself. So you can't control, right, our listeners all the time, but we definitely want to make sure that we're as clear as possible with our expectations and clear as possible with what it is that we're trying to communicate or have somebody understand. It's just a lot more effective that way. If we're kind of vague, or if people don't really know what they're supposed to do, then it turns into a situation where it probably won't get accomplished. And actually, that's one reason why in a lot of workplaces now they really focus on role playing. I don't know if you all have been in work situations where they do this, but I've noticed that in a lot of work meetings now, it's fairly common to have a manager talk about a new expectation for a business, or for the team or for a group, and then before that meeting's done, have you break out, with somebody else and practice back and forth talking through that new situation or practicing on that new expectation. So at a bank, for example, let's say, a manager comes in and says, okay, we have a goal to sell some more credit cards this week. We need to talk about credit cards more. So here's an example of how we might talk about credit cards. You're sitting with a client, you say, Mr. Smith, I see that you don't have a credit card here at the bank. Do you use a credit card? And they say yes or no. Okay, let's say they say yes. Okay, great. Our credit card, does a great job with points and can get you a lot of rewards. Is that something that you'd be interested in hearing more about? And then, after that example, which that was just on the fly, and I don't sell credit cards, so that probably wasn't very good. But the idea is, after you've given that example as a manager, then you allow the employees to get with each other and practice, like one person's the customer and one person is the banker, and go through a scenario where you basically ask them about credit cards and see if you can sell them on exploring, or accomplishing a credit card through the bank. So point is, sometimes in a situation where we're training on something, we can come to understanding, right? But like we talked about in week 1 and week 2, and we've talked about every single week, step 1 is to get them to understand and to verify that there's understanding. But step 2, and perhaps the most important step, is that more than understanding, we get to a point where they will do something with the information and understanding that they've acquired. So if we understand how to sell a credit card, that's one thing. We need to probably practice it, though, to get proficient at it and to motivate us to actually feel like we're confident enough to do it, right? So that's where role playing comes in and where practicing comes in. It gives us especially with training, I think it's highly effective. It can be kind of annoying as an employee to role play with other people and kind of uncomfortable, but it definitely helps your ability to be confident when you get back into a work situation with a customer, to accomplish what it is that management wants you to start to focus on. All right, so those are some of the high-level, points from the articles. Like I say, you've got 2 short videos, and then you've got 2 articles to read for this last week. Those are required readings, and just as a reminder, in order to get full credit on the discussion board, it needs to be evident that you can demonstrate that you read the articles and watched the videos. Those are required readings, and the only way in a class like this that we can demonstrate that is through our discussion board comments. So be careful that you read and listen to that material before you do your discussion board posts, so that you can, within your discussion board posts, demonstrate to me as the person grading it that you've done the minimum requirement, which is to review those. Okay, you can always use those as a reference too on your post. You don't have to worry about trying to get a new reference. You can use either of the articles or videos that are within the instructions for the discussion board for that week. All right, so moving on to a couple different books on communication that I think are excellent. And I would, they're not required reading for the course, but if you were trying to find very good material on communicating effectively within the workplace, these are excellent resources, and ones that I would suggest that you add to your collection if you have a few books that you like to review and try to get better at communicating with. So one is called Crucial Conversations. It's by a company called Vital Smarts. They're basically a business consulting firm made up of some professors and business individuals that have had different businesses. They came together. There's about 5 different authors, so I didn't list them here. But if you Google Crucial Conversations, there's a couple different books by this group. They're out of Utah, but it's a book that's nationally well recognized for business. And Crucial Conversations is basically a book about having important conversations with other people. And you might think, well, yeah, that's important, but we already know that. It's not trying to convince you that that's important, right? We already know that having critical conversations or crucial conversations with other people is an important part of communicating, an important part of just living, having good relationships. Their point is not to convince you that it's important. Their point is to try to help you understand how to have crucial conversations, good, purposeful conversations with other people. It's an excellent read. It brings out a lot of good points and examples that are really helpful. And basically, you're reading a book that might cost you $7 or $10 or $12 on Amazon. And this is a group of consultants that go around to Fortune 500 companies and charge thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to train on that material for executives and managers to be able to get better at having crucial conversations. So another thing that's kind of interesting is if you're talking with somebody about effective communication and they say crucial conversations, these guys tagged crucial conversations. So if you ever hear that, from somebody talking about business or talking about effective communication, that's exactly where it came from, is this book. Okay, so they talk about a lot of different things in the book, and I'm not gonna cover everything, but just some high level points about crucial conversations. And basically, we need crucial conversations within a workplace because our goal is to improve productivity, right? And improving productivity improves efficiency, which improves profitability, right? And in the end, if we're managers of a company, we're trying to maximize profitability. That's the value proposition or the value principle as far as value maximization that you learn about in finance. Managers and owners of companies are laser focused on trying to improve and grow profitability of their entity, right? And productivity is a key to that. If we're productive, then we're able to push that needle. If nobody's productive in a workplace, then it's very difficult to move the needle. And you have a lot of businesses that start off really efficient and effective and productive, and then they get to a point where they hit some kind of critical mass and they can become less effective. They can become stagnant. They can have teams of folks who are not really working well as a team anymore. And usually that has to do with communication. So they talk about silence or violence. basically, this is our visceral reaction to any situation. So if somebody has offended us, okay, or if somebody has rubbed us wrong within a workplace, most of us, we've got two responses to that. Either we lash out at them, right, in some way. It may not be face to face, but we lash out and try to hurt them in some way, or talk about them negatively in some way, or we're just silent about it. And either one of those approaches, the idea is, yeah, that's the natural way that we respond to things within a work environment, but neither one of them's helpful, and both of them can stifle production. They give a story. One of the stories that one of the authors talks about in this case is a CFO of a company that goes to board meetings and never offers his opinion on anything. And when they go to that CFO and say, hey, you're a critical part of this company, you have a fiduciary responsibility as a CFO, as one of the executives, to give your opinion, especially to give some feedback on what this company's doing, the direction that they're going. And you're not giving any feedback, so what gives? And basically, they find out that the CFO just was offended 7 or 8 years earlier in a board meeting because the CEO kind of made it seem like his opinions weren't going to be valued, and that they were going to do whatever the CEO wanted to do, and it didn't matter what the CFO said. And so he had been offended by that. Still did his job, did the numbers, was a good CFO for the company, but was a very smart person that was not giving any feedback in board meetings for a company, which is unacceptable. But because they had resorted to silence because of a negative situation that had occurred. So it was affecting the productivity, it was affecting the efficiency, and frankly, just the bottom line success of that company, to have one of their key players, one of their key executives, not offering feedback, counsel, opinion, and direction to what the company was doing. All because they had gotten into a situation where they were offended and had never confronted the situation, and had that crucial conversation to make sure they could mend that bridge and move forward. Okay, so what the book focuses on and what these consultants focus on is how we talk to ourselves, basically. And this is not verbally talking to ourselves. It's not carrying a conversation, like maybe a crazy person does, that has a mental illness, that talks out loud to themselves over and over and over again. That's not what they're referring to. What they're referring to is how sometimes even subconsciously we build a story about every single situation that we get in. So sometimes, because of a way that we've told the story or because of life's experiences, we're hardwired to have a certain type of story come into our head. So just as an example, you might be one of these students at Stevens Henniker that has had some bad experiences with professors or with teachers in your past. And let's say we get into this class and you get some feedback on an assignment that you at first glance just disagree with. You think, hey, I fulfilled all the requirements. Why am I not getting full credit? And you start to feel yourself getting frustrated, right? I must be one of these professors that just isn't very fair. All professors are dumb. They're so anal about what they do, and they think so highly of all these hoops we have to jump through, and it's so important to them. Then they just nitpick at everything we do, and you start to form this story around what it was that I was thinking when I gave you the score I did. But that story could be completely wrong. Okay, and every story that we come up with can be completely wrong. And one of the things that we have to do, especially in a workplace, is give people the benefit of the doubt, is to back away from the story that we created and think through a potential opposite side of the story. Okay, and many times that potential opposite side of the story, or in some cases just the benefit of the doubt, will keep us from getting stressed out and emotional and responding in a way that's not productive. Okay, and getting frustrated in a way that can really be ineffective and non-productive. Another example is you have a manager come and they say, okay, everybody, we need everybody to come 5 minutes early. We're not going to pay you for that time, but you need to be early to work. And the first thing that might come into your head is, they can't make me do that. I don't have to do that. this is just managers trying to abuse us as employees. I mean, that could be the story that you create in your mind right off the bat, right? And then if you were to back up and, take the manager aside one-on-one for a few minutes and just say, okay, I'm trying to understand and figure out what this 5 minutes early thing is. They might have an explanation for that has nothing to do with them trying to take advantage and abuse employees, and just make them do stuff that people don't want to do. And because you took the time to try to have that crucial conversation and try to really figure out, have some understanding, right? Some real understanding, not your story that you put onto the situation, but true understanding based on that person really being able to communicate what the real scenario was. And in one of the books, I don't remember if it's in the book or one of the presentations they do online, they talk about, father buys the son, a pretty expensive golf jacket at a golf course that they, famous golf course that they went to. They're flying home from this experience, and the son was just ecstatic about this golf jacket, and the dad was really excited and proud, that he was able to get that. So then they're on the plane and they're eating pancakes, and the syrup container, the son opens up the syrup container, it gets all over the front of his jacket, and he acts like he didn't even care, and he just eats his pancakes. Well, the dad is watching this, and as you can imagine, just having bought it, is getting, can feel himself getting really uncomfortable and stressed out, and wants to yell at him for, acting so careless and spilling syrup on a brand new jacket that was really expensive that he just bought him. It was, you kind of go through this story as a parent. You're careless. I can't believe, you would be so careless and ruin something that I spent, hard-earned money on. You feel entitled. We come up with all these stories, of what really is going on in a kid's mind. And he said, because he's presented on this, it's one of the authors of the book and about crucial conversations. He said, okay, that's my story, but maybe I'm missing something. So he said, son, I noticed that you spilled some syrup on the front of your jacket. And before he could even finish the line, in a very kind way, he was just going to ask, what happened, or make note of it. The son just started. He looked down and was really surprised to see that he had done that. He had truly not even noticed. He's just a teenager eating food and focusing on his food, right? But when he did notice the syrup on the front of his jacket, he started crying. Just a kid that doesn't ever cry started crying because he felt so bad, and asking his dad, hey, what can we do to clean it off? How can I clean it? I didn't know this, just that whole thing. And so that conversation was very different than what it could have happened if he would have escalated, and what he was feeling, which was really a lot of frustration at first, and kind of yelled at him or been negative with him. That kind of interaction would have been a whole different thing, or a whole different outcome potentially than what did happen when he was trying to just understand. Okay, so long story for a short situation, which is we tell ourselves stories and get stressed out about stories that we create for situations, and many times they're not true. But many times, even if they are true, if we'll back up on a situation and process through it, and process through how to be constructive through that situation and through that story, even if it is correct after we verify, the situation will go very differently than if we allow our emotions that get penned up because of our story that we're creating and how we're talking to ourselves and the story that we're creating around a situation to play out the way that just would if we don't think through it and process it. So their idea is, and their very successful idea is to challenge and change these stories, right? So instead of being a victim or a villain or helpless, which is kind of the story theme that ends up happening in almost every single situation, right, that's kind of tense, we say, look, am I being a victim here? Am I being a villain here? Or am I being helpless here? How can I challenge that? How can I challenge that story that I'm communicating with myself in my mind and proceed in a more constructive way? And we justify our silence or violence with that victim, villain, helpless, role. Okay. When we're the victim, we can be silent and give somebody the silent treatment and not want to approach the situation or be confrontational. And we can also be violent. And we don't mean violent like take out a knife and stab somebody. We mean violent as in we get really charged up, right? And maybe say things that we don't mean, or maybe get really frustrated. And in moments like that, like I say, it's very difficult to be productive and be constructive in a situation. Another thing that we have to have the story, is that even if we're in a tense situation where we can give somebody the benefit of the doubt, it doesn't mean that we take accountability away, obviously. So in the story of the father and the son, it doesn't mean that the son doesn't have to take accountability for spilling syrup on himself and try to fix the situation, right? It doesn't take that away at all. So one of the things that people hold on to is they think that if they aren't violent about a situation or aren't really confrontational about a situation, that somebody's not going to be accountable for something they should be accountable for. And it couldn't be further from the truth. You can approach a situation and fix and be more constructive about a situation and how you communicate in a situation without tearing somebody and without being so confrontational and violent, as their words, right? In a violent way. And we're just talking about communication here. We're not talking about physical violence. So we can maintain accountability even though we can give somebody the benefit of the doubt and try to have understanding and try to accomplish understanding before we get to trying to change the situation. And their point is, obviously this is what they do from a consulting standpoint for businesses and for Fortune 500 companies and for relationships among executives and management, when they really need to have those crucial conversations to keep the teamwork and productivity of a group intact, that a lot of times will grow stagnant or create, have problems at some point that keeps that team from really being highly productive. But it can work in any situation. So, yes, it works in business, and it's been highly successful in how they've rolled this consulting out to lots of different companies. But for you and I, even if we're not part of a team, even if we're not a manager, usually we have some relationships, siblings, parents, children, spouse, partner, whatever it is. We've got relationships, even beyond our career and beyond work. And understanding these stories that we're creating around situations and around conversations can help us to process through, and then once again can help us to challenge and change those stories, so that we can communicate more effectively and so that we can have constructive conversations with people, not conversations that tend to hurt and destroy and create additional problems with those relationships. Okay. The idea is you get to the point where you can have tough conversations with people, conversations that absolutely need to happen about, different changes that have to happen. These are hard things, but because you've done your homework, you've processed through, how it is that you're going to say it and why, and how you can give somebody the benefit of the doubt and have understanding before you get to a point where you're asking them to change or asking yourself to change, one or the other, that you can accomplish that you can process that and then be more constructive about your conversations is the point of Crucial Conversations by Vital Smarts. Okay. Really famous book called How to Win Friends and Influence People. Sounds kind of hokey, but Dale Carnegie years ago wrote this book. It's one of the most read books in business, in communications that exists. And he just goes through different, chapter by chapter, different points on how to basically sell people is another way of saying that. Win friends and influence people. But basically how we talked about sales in week 1, if you'll remember, was we're all trying to have influence, right? Whether or not we consciously or subconsciously know it, we're all trying to have influence and, and improve relationships and affect those relationships in some way. And so whether or not we're selling at work or just selling, ourselves to friends, family, spouse, whatever it is, we are all, selling ideas and we're all trying to influence. And so communication obviously is the key to that. And Dale Carnegie goes through some different methods for, really effectively communicating. One of them is alignment. And he talks about how, obviously if you enjoy a certain type of food, okay, and you're going to go fishing, and you just assume that all the fish will like the same food as you, and you put that food on the hook and throw it out, you might not get any bites, right? And everybody would look at that, scenario and say, of course not. This is oversimplified. This is too easy. But it's amazing how often you and I, when we're trying to communicate something that's important to us with someone else, or we're trying to share an idea with someone else, that we are so focused on what it is that we like, our preferences, that we forget that we need to align with our audience first. We need to connect. And we've talked about this theme of connecting. The more you connect, the more you can have influence and, accomplish something. So he talks about it in a little bit different way, but we need to make sure and align needs, which the only way you're going to know is by asking and making sure that you have understanding and being a good listener to start, or doing your homework about the audience that you're going to be speaking with, right? So it works with a big audience, but it also works just one-on-one with other people. When you understand their needs, then they will react better to what you're communicating, right? We talked about the quote last week that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care, right? That's the idea of alignment and connection. So he also talks about, when it comes to friends and influence, having genuine interest, and how that really creates deep-rooted friendships and relationships. If we don't have a deep interest, and people can sense that we don't have a deep interest, then it's going to be very difficult to have a deeply rooted friendship with that person. Okay, and there might be people out there in the world that we're not trying to have a deeply rooted friendship with. So that's I get that. But then there are a lot of important people in our lives that we should want that, right? And one of the ways we can do that, or at least help that, is to really have genuine interest, not just superficial interest. Hey, how was your day? And they get like 2 words into it, and then we change the subject, or it's obvious we don't even care, we're not even listening. That becomes evident pretty quick to people. They can see and feel through that, and so we have to be genuine about our interest. And even if it takes some practice, at first it may be kind of awkward if we're not very good at this, and I'm not very good at this, but it's something that, with some time and with some practice, I think we can get better at. One of the things that I thought was interesting that Carnegie talks about is admitting wrongs emphatically. Okay, admitting wrongs emphatically. What does this mean? This means that instead of, when a manager says, hey, you made a mistake with this, instead of us saying, oh, I was thinking of something, we come up with, the natural person in most of us would come up with some kind of excuse to minimize, the amount of wrong that occurred. And Dale's point is, don't even try. Don't even make an excuse. Don't even try to defend yourself at first, right? Especially if it's a legitimate issue, or some kind of mistake that you really made. An example of this would be, tellers at a bank. Tellers at a bank have to, obviously, they have a box of what they call their box, but they have a register where they have their cash transactions and coin from the day. So they're giving people cash back and coin, or they're taking cash and coin to put into people's accounts. And at the end of the day, that cash and coin that they've got in their box or in their register needs to, what's called, balance. So it needs to be consistent with what the computer program that they're using, as people come and go, says that they should have. And what happens a lot of times is tellers will, there'll be a few pennies off, or something will happen where it's not perfect, right? Well, if it's significantly off, that's obviously an issue, right? Because that means a client or a customer didn't get the amount of money that they were supposed to, that somebody miscounted something, and either they, got less credit than they were supposed to, or more credit than they're supposed to. And either way, if it's a big number, that's not good. That reflects very poorly on the bank. So tellers are always laser focused on trying to balance and trying to keep their numbers accurate. So in this example of admitting wrongs emphatically, if a manager came to you as a teller and said, so and so, you didn't balance yesterday and you were off by about $100, which is that's a big, uh, you were way off, not just a few pennies, but by $100. Instead of saying, yeah, yesterday was just so busy, and we had those really angry customers, and I really had a migraine. We could go through 100 different excuses that might even be legitimate reasons why that happened. But instead of doing that, if you were to say, "Oh my gosh, I really screwed up. I'm really sorry. I can't believe that happened. But yeah, I just that's horrible. And I've got to do better, and I will find out what happened." Um, that kind of response versus the excuses, Dale Carnegie is convinced, helps you to develop significant relationships. If you're the person that's always going to give excuses, you become less and less trustworthy to folks who depend on you. If you're the person that just absolutely fesses up even before you're caught, even before it's an issue, and even makes a bigger deal of it than you would expect in a situation like that, then managers or relationships that we have are basically put in a situation where you took responsibility and you committed to do better. uh, there's they really can't go after you at that point. And that's what that's what his point is that you kind of draw the poison out of a situation if you're just emphatically you admit emphatically to what happened instead of trying to make excuses. An interesting point, and one that really helps the workplace environment, if you own up to things and be accountable to things instead of making excuses. So how do you change people without giving offense or creating resentment? Okay, this is a very difficult thing to do. He talks about how one of the things that you do is you talk about your own mistakes, you talk about your own challenges before you come into something that they could improve on. So, and they don't have to be even related, right? He talks about how, if you've got somebody that you're trying to say, look, I need you to stop smoking, and you care about them, and so you want them to stop. Instead of just walking up to them and being like, dude, you got to stop smoking. Maybe you have a relationship with somebody already of influence and you can do that. But most people don't have that kind of relationship with somebody where they can just walk into a friendship and say something like that. But what we can do is we can talk about a challenge that we've had, and it might not be even related, but overcoming that challenge or changing, in some way, and just saying, something effective. Hey, it was really hard. It's very difficult. I understand it's really difficult, but it's really one of those things that we just, sometimes we gotta do something like that, and then transition into, a request, of that person, some kind of change of that person, and instead of just going after them, always be able to communicate something that's a challenge for you personally, and a challenge that maybe you overcame, or a mistake that you made at some point. That draws, like I say, some of the defensiveness out of the person when you get to the point where you're going to communicate some kind of change that you'd like to see in them. So just something to keep in mind. Anyway, a lot of good tips in this book by Dale Carnegie. It's time tested, man. This book's been around for a long time, and it's kind of a gold standard as far as communicating. Some of the stuff seems a little heavy-handed and manipulative in it, as I read through it. I've read it a couple different times, but that it doesn't matter. I don't have to execute on it the way that he describes. I can make it my own, and execute on it in a way that fits my personality and the way that I'd want to do it to be more genuine uh, in how I approach it. But the points that he makes, generally speaking, are just excellent. They're excellent things to think about as far as how we interact, how we communicate with other people, and how we achieve greater influence with other people. And I'll say this, Dale Carnegie, you might get to the end of the book and think, wow, this guy's just so power hungry. He just wanted to manipulate. He just wants to teach people how to manipulate other people, and so they can have more power. I would say, whether or not that was his intention or not, or whether or not people interpret it that way or not, really doesn't matter. because you and I don't have to use it that way. You and I can use it to influence for good relationships that are important to us, right? And our career and our workplace relationships probably will be important to us. But even if they're not, at least our family, friends, people that we have a good relationship with and know and love, it can help those relationships, and not in a manipulative way, but just in a way that improves, the relationship that we have, and through some of these different tips and things that he does. So, How to Win Friends and Influence People, kind of a hokey title, but a great book. We don't have time tonight to talk about Maxwell or Covey. We might save that for next week. But we need to wrap up this evening. Have a great week this week with the discussion board. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns about anything at this point. And yeah, just 2 weeks left, less than 2 weeks left of this mod. So get caught up. Make sure you've got 7 posts to this point. And I look forward to a great discussion board this week. Have a great night, and we'll talk next week.